Pieces of your fairway or green missing? Land automatically flattening when you build fairways and greens? Well, today I'm going to show you how to fix these issues when they come up and how to avoid them in the first place. Right here on ErixonStone's Technical Tips for Course Design. Hi, I'm ErixonStone. You can catch me on Twitch at twitch.tv/ErixonStone and follow me on Twitter at ErixonStone. Now, let's get started. Hey, welcome everyone. Just to start, we're gonna start a new course, and we're going to SCULPT versus landscape, and then we're gonna come down to the terrain menu. And if you haven't seen my video about the settings when you get started, check the card up here and I'll leave a link in the description. So today I'm going to set my water level and hills as high as they go, and I'm going to set everything else down to nothing. And then I'm going to do the same with my layout. I'm going to set all of these down to 0 as well. And what I'm going to talk about today is issues with the water table in PGA Tour 2K21's Course Designer. So a lot of people have asked, what's the difference between the SCULPT and landscape commands? Other than the fact that when you choose a SCULPT command, you get a red brush, and when you use the landscape command, you get a blue brush. What do these brushes mean and how do they work? We'll cover that today. The most important thing to note is that sculpting changes the default terrain, and landscape changes the actual modified terrain. It modifies the terrain in a way that overrides and supersedes the SCULPT command. So what I'm going to do is, in order to start, I'm going to use the landscape raise brush. I'm going to use a fuzzier brush here, and I will raise the terrain right over here, just so that there's no more water in that area. Then, when I create a surface, and I create a fairway or a green using a brush, I'll just build this right in here, make it nice and big so you can see what's happening, place it, and part of my fairway is missing. And the reason for that is, if we go back to the original spot before I raised anything, you can see that this part of the area where I placed the brush is under the water. And I modified it using the landscape tool. Right, so if I sculpt the land and choose the landscape raise, and I raise the landscape, but I raised all this landscape. What's happening here is my layer of modified terrain is above 0 feet elevation, or the water table, but the default terrain that underlies it is still below the water table. When I use a brush in order to create a surface, a green or fairway surface, when I placed that brush down on the ground, the area that was underneath the water table, which is this cutout here, cannot hold a fairway or green, so it's cut out from my fairway. Now what's interesting is you can use this to your advantage, but by and large today, since the advent of splines, no one really uses the brushes and runs into this problem all as often. But if you do happen to use the brush, this is a potential issue that you might face. So how do we fix it? So we come in here and we sculpt the land, and we choose sculpt raise or sculpt flatten, and we raise it up with the red brush. You can see that I've raised this, and I'll raise it up, do that, and you can see my fairway has now reappeared, and my land is not affected. Why? Well, the reason for that is because the blue brushes, the landscape tool, any work that you do with the landscape tool or the blue brush will supersede whatever you do with the red brush. So that means that by modifying this area of the plot with the blue brush or the landscape tool, that means that the red tool, the sculpt tool, or the red brush, will not have any effect on my final terrain. So now what I'm going to do is come over to this area and create surfaces, create a fairway with a brush, and I will go ahead and place this brush down right there. You can see it had an impact here on the land a little bit. If I go ahead and remove it, you can see that the land sort of regains its bumpiness. Right? And if I place the brush down, you can see that it's been smoothed out a little bit by the presence of this fairway brush. Again, this happens because the terrain underneath this fairway is the default terrain. And what I would like to do is have this not auto-flatten. So what I want to do here is I want to sculpt the land, and if I raise the land, modify it in some way, go ahead and raise all of this up, modify this terrain, right, and created some really funky hills here. We'll just go ahead and flatten some of those out just for the sake of it. Okay, so I still have this, and when I go and create a fairway, and I use my brush, you can see that I didn't lose the characteristics of the fairway. You can see I just painted fairway on top of the very rough terrain here, very bumpy and lumpy terrain. So those are the two things that you can do, or two ways that you can fix auto-flattening or missing sections of fairway or green. But how do we avoid this in the first place? And the way we do that is in the way that we build our plot. So I'm going to create a new course, and this is going to be manual plot. And again, what I'm going to do here is lower the water level, hills, trees, plants, grass, rocks, down to 0. Then I'm going to go to layout, and I'm also going to set my course properties, fairways, greens, green bunkers, and fairway bunkers all the way down to 0. Apply that. And continue. And I'm going to use the sculpt land, and I'm going to use the sculpt. I'm going to use sculpt flatten. And I'll take this large red brush. Just gonna flatten this terrain out so that I don't have any water on the plot anymore. See him raising it up a little bit, and just flatten over here until I can eliminate most of it. And I've still maintained humps and bumps in the plot, but I've eliminated all the water puddling. And then what you can do, go ahead and use the landscape tool now to go and create some bigger hills if you want. something that looks like this. And you can sink an area. Create some more interesting terrain here. Right, and go ahead and raise, and then take this brush, drop it down in this area just to sink it, and then add here to create my own water bodies. And this will help eliminate all of the issues with the water table that you don't see, where you have sections of fairway. And the reason is because the red or the sculpt brush was used to modify the default layer of terrain so that all of the default terrain is above 0 elevation or the water table, and that will prevent the issues that you may have water and missing parts of your fairway. Right, so I've created some water, some interesting terrain on this side over here, and now when I create a new fairway, so create surfaces, fairway, and I'll still use the brush, and I create this here, I no longer have an issue with that. Or when I create a brush like this, right, and then I go and I sculpt the land with the landscape flatten tool, for example. When I raise the land here, the fairway will just show up. It'll just appear. And it'll make it a little bit easier to work with the terrain here. See that this area didn't auto flatten, so if I want a flatter land, I have to go and do that myself. Right over here. Just like that. Just like that. Now I created this fairway on my own. I've not run into any water table issues. Wherever I just raised the land above the water, my fairway has reappeared without any problem. I've built this fairway, and I've kept in a lot of the bumpiness of the fairway that I wanted. So that's how we avoid these issues going forward when we start a new course. Takes everything completely out of the equation, and we never have to run into any issues with building fairways and greens ever again. I hope that was helpful to everyone. Again, if you liked the video, give a like and a subscribe down at the bottom. Until next time, happy designing.